Chapter 5. The Plot Thickens. Well, that's all well and great. You came here looking for trouble, and you got more than you bargained for. Does that sum it all up? The sergeant said furiously while pounding his rifle at the mercenary's face. The sergeant started pacing the room with his hands on his hips. His breathing became increasingly audible and more erratic with each passing moment. His eyes had this fire and brimstone kind of intensity to them. His face became noticeably redder as he stared at Maddox. Sergeant Allen was waiting for some kind of explanation from the mercenary. Maddox hobbled over from the ground and propped up against the wall. Maddox's inattention or apathy only further enraged the sergeant. He grabbed Corporal Barnes' ballistic helmet off the ground and shoved it into Maddox's chest. The helmet sloshed with blood, guts, and brain matter. Listen here, sweetheart. None of what you told me explains why the fuck one of my men is splattered across the room like a bunch of fucking hamburger meat. The sergeant screamed at Maddox and repeatedly slammed his fist against the wall. Each punch left a bloodied imprint of the sergeant's knuckles on the wall. The thuds of the punches bellowed the hallways of the biolab. Clang! 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 The sergeant abruptly stopped assaulting the wall and paused, redirecting his anger towards the mercenary. He started favoring his hand. Apparently, when you get in a fight with a stainless steel wall, the wall always wins. He looked down at his hand, and it was covered in blood. What the sergeant couldn't tell is how much of that blood was his and how much was Corporal Barnes's blood. Maddox looked down at the helmet and uncontrollably vomited all over it. Ah, great. What's next? Are you going to start crying? The sergeant said. DeStefano started methodically pillaging what was left of Barnes's mangled corpse. He started with recovering any munitions. He looted his corpse with an indifferent attitude. Sir. What? He must have encountered a sizable force. He unloaded nearly all of his ammunition. There's shell casings all over the fucking place. This place is littered with bullet holes. Sergeant Allen was struck with a look of complete bewilderment. The hallway was tattooed with bullet holes and shell casings, but only the scattered pieces of Corporal Barnes remained. There were no traces of what Barnes was shooting at. He looked sharply at DeStefano and then back again at Maddox. What the fuck are we up against down here? He was supposed to be guarding an empty hallway. How many other mercenaries are down here? He desperately pleaded with Maddox as he pointed down an empty bullet-ridden corridor. Janowski, Hernandez, Whitaker, Lindell, DeStefano. On me. The remaining squad members circled up on the staff sergeant, Allen. They stood poised and ready to roll out on a moment's notice. We stay in tight formation. No one goes anywhere alone until we figure out what the fuck we're up against. Copy? Copy. Sir, yes, sir. Roger that. Tight as a virgin on prom night. The staff sergeant shook his head at the immature remark. Who else but Hernandez would crack wise in a situation like this? As for you, the sergeant said and turned his focus back towards the mercenary. Maddox was trained directly at the pool of blood surrounding what was left of Corporal Barnes. The pool was scattered about 8 feet around the room. Every wall was covered with blood and brain matter, like a piece of modern splattered paint art. Now you can talk to me, or you can talk to the gunnery sergeant over there. It's up to you. DeStefano was fervently itching to polish his interrogation skills. He slowly pulled his combat knife from his boot for dramatic effect. He started cleaning his fingernails with the tip of his 6-inch blue steel combat knife. Maddox looked unfazed by the threatening gesture. Allen shook his head and patted Maddox on the shoulders with both hands. He shook his head and walked away with his back turned to Maddox. DeStefano's expression sharply changed by the sergeant's unspoken order. He took the sergeant's cue as an excuse to immediately go to work. He grabbed Maddox's hair and pulled his knife up to her throat. He slid the knife slowly up towards her jugular vein. The knife made a peculiar sound as it grazed the neck skin of the mercenary. DeStefano started using the knife to point around the room as he began to interrogate Maddox. You see, the sergeant over there, he said while pointing with the knife. He began to tap the flat end of the knife on Maddox's forehead. The tapping made a faint squishy thud as the cold blade smacked the mercenary's olive oil skin. Tap, tap, tap. He's a bit by the book kind of guy. Me, on the other hand, I'm a fuck the book kind of guy. I'm going to ask you something. I'm going to ask you one time. Do you understand me? Maddox looked up at the gunnery sergeant with her big blue eyes. Nod your head once if you understand me, he said with the knife pressed up against Maddox's throat. Maddox slowly and cautiously nodded in affirmation. How many mercenaries are we up against? Maddox remained silent. DeStefano applied more pressure to the knife. Her skin began to turn pale. It was just 3 of us, she replied somewhat cooperatively. Ah, see? That wasn't so hard, was it? Don't feel too bad. Even the toughest hombres crack with a knife pressed up against their throat. DeStefano smiled, twirled his knife, and shoved it back into his booth sheath. Now, please explain what the fuck happened down here. We took a job. The squadron of men looked around at each other in a somewhat confused manner. The men couldn't figure out what kind of morons would try to infiltrate a bioweapons lab during a hurricane. You took a job, sweetie. We heard that part of the story. So, then what happened? We borrowed one of the fishing boats in the marina. Borrowed? Let's get the bullshit, shall we? You fucking stole it, Hernandez interrupted. If you don't mind, we are somewhat pressed for time. Let's cut with the pleasantries and semantics, Sergeant Allen interjected. Okay. You stole the boat. Then what happened? DeStefano asked while beginning to light up a cigarette. Do you mind if I have some water? Maddox asked. Water? Are you sure? I'm sorry, are the accommodations not up to your standards? Can we get you a steak dinner and a reach around? Hernandez said jokingly. Sergeant Allen snapped his fingers at Hernandez and pointed to his near-empty cantina. Yes, sir. Anything you want, sir. I'm here to serve, he said and threw his cantina over to Sergeant Allen. Sergeant Allen snatched the cantina out of the air and walked over to the mercenary. He outstretched his arms and extended the cantina to the thirsty mercenary. Maddox and Allen locked eyes. She grabbed the cantina from Allen, or at least she tried, but he didn't let go. What happened? He asked. Just as Maddox was about to utter the explanation, a rustling down the hallway caught the attention of the duo. Simultaneously, the remaining squad turned towards the threat with guns ready to meet any kind of resistance. The men beamed LED lights down the hallway for more thorough examination. The corridor was lit up with a fluorescent blue, but to everyone's dismay, it was just a couple of rats scurrying down the hall. What happened? Maddox said as she slowly stood from her seated position. Allen sharply turned back to Maddox, still with his gun drawn. The adrenaline started to subside, and he lowered his guard. Maddox instinctively put up her hands, not defensively, but to block the LED light that was pointed right in her face. Would you mind? It's true what they say about you recon guys, huh? Yeah? What's that? You guys are a bunch of fucking adrenaline junkies with itchy trigger fingers. If you have an itch that you need to scratch, all you gotta do is ask, sweetie, Hernandez said. Check that shit, Hernandez, DeStefano said kindly to his comrade. As you were saying? Well, we commandeered the fishing boat and strategically crash-landed on the west coast of the island. How'd you manage to pull that off? DeStefano inquired. Didn't the Coast Guard intervene? Hernandez asked. From the channel side, there's a considerable amount of leeway. Fishing boats get a considerable amount of slack, trust, especially when it's severe weather conditions. Once we actually hit the island, the Coast Guard loses jurisdiction, and the island security takes over. Simple as that? Allen asked. Basically, yeah, she said and took a long swig of water from the cantina. Maddox slowly emptied out the cantina and went so far as to hold it up above her head to let the remaining droplets pour into her mouth. We scuttled the boat off the western shore of the island. Not exactly how we planned it, but it worked. We came in, just the three of us, disguised as fishermen. The island security took 10 minutes to respond to the scene, at which point we had plenty of time to fake our injuries, she explained. Ah. Maddox leaned in against the wall to take a breather. The wall was rolled steel and ice cold to the touch. Like I said, we washed up on shore, waited for about 10 minutes until we were greeted by 2 goons from the private security company. 2 guards? That's it? For the whole island? Yep, the island operates on a skeleton crew over the weekend. Lovely. Go on. The guards rushed down to the beach, to the scene of the crash. Like I said, they were run-of-the-mill security goons, head-to-toe Boy Scouts, like G.I. Joe over there, she said as she pointed to Janowaski. You still haven't told me, Dick. How many other mercs are on the island? What kind of resistance are we dealing with? DeStefano further inquired. They aren't mercs, not anymore. Anymore? What the fuck is that supposed to mean? Hernandez asked. Hernandez, shut the fuck up and let the lady explain, please. Go on, DeStefano said in a pleasant tone of voice. The security team loaded us up on their pickup, and we headed to the island med bay. Everything was running as smooth as a baby's bottom, she explained. Just like that, no questions, no level of scrutiny. They took your situation at face value, DeStefano asked. Maddox scoffed and asked, When you got here, how was the visibility? It was shit. We couldn't see her past our decks, he replied. Well, I can tell you one thing. It was a lot fucking worse when we made our crash landing, she said. I guess the gods figured you'd have to be pretty fucking stupid to try a night landing on a small island during a hurricane, DeStefano said. That would seem to be the case, she replied softly. The mercenary shifted to alleviate some of her physical discomfort. She paused for a moment to scan the room and get a good idea of what was going on. Everything was going according to plan until... Until what? DeStefano asked in a soft tone to match the mercenary. One of the security guards, something Dirk said, or something he did, I don't know. The guard made us... Dirk popped off. Sweetheart, let's dispense with the cute euphemisms, shall we? DeStefano repeated his earlier request in somewhat more of a forceful tone of voice. He killed both the guards during transport. During the struggle, the pickup truck crashed into one of the backup generators. You want us to believe the 3 of you invaded Plum Island? Just the 3 of you? Janowaski broke his silence and interceded into a conversation. Believe whatever you want. That's what happened, she said resolutely. You see what's left of my friend over there on the ground? Hernandez asked while approaching the mercenary from the side. Hernandez grabbed Maddox by the back of the neck and shoved her face into the fermenting mess that was Corporal Barnes' mangled, rotting corpse. Once I saw this man clear an entire house full of insurgents by himself, single-fucking-handedly. He took 2 bullets and a knife to the back during the process. And you want me to believe a couple of mercenaries or some rent-a-cop on steroids did this to him? Hernandez grabbed her by the vest and shoved her up against the wall. The back of her helmet cracked against the wall and made a loud thud that echoed down the corridor. We were sold a bag of goods. These guards were anything but rent-a-cops. One of the guards recognized Dirk's hand tattoo. Marine Regiment. She explained while conjuring some strength to resist the uncomfortable grip of Hernandez. Hernandez looked at Maddox with a disjointed gaze. His curiosity got the better of his rage, and his fury subsided. He slowly loosened his grip. He cautiously released Maddox from his vice grip, like a toddler dropping her drag doll. We hijacked the transport and swapped gear with the security guards. We still had the element of surprise, and the power was running on backup generators. Dirk was rather relentless. The mercenary was sitting in a puddle of blood, almost completely devoid of emotion. Her face told a horrible story that her voice could barely utter. She was running on empty. She was running on fumes. She was running on nothing but adrenaline. This Dirk guy sounds like a real winner, DeStefano said while looking over the squad. Just as Maddox was about to chime in to defend her fallen colleague, a garbled transmission flared the radio waves. Alpha team! Alpha team! This is... The transmission was abruptly overtaken by a flurry of static. Hernandez started fiddling around with the radio. He stubbornly adjusted the radio dial in some desperate attempt to reach the other squadron. Bravo team! Repeat transmission! Bravo team, come in! Hernandez's attempts failed to receive anything more than static. We've got nothing, sir. The comms are tits up. Maddox, I hope you can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. Let's finish this bedtime story on the way to the generator, Sergeant Allen said. Sir! What, Hernandez? Hernandez jogged up to the sergeant's position and leaned in close. We have an island full of ex-special operators guarding what, exactly? Some kind of experimental super soldier serum? What the fuck is going on? Allen cleared his throat with a large cough. His judgment was clouded, and his concentration was shot. The sergeant took a deep breath and reclaimed his focus. Here's the plan. We have a job to do, people. We stay on mission. We're going to link up with Bravo Team, find Dr. Kerrigan, and get the nuclear reactor back online. Sir, my vote is we get topside and radio for backup. Hernandez chimed in with his latest threat assessment. I mean, that sounds good to me, too, Maddox said. Lindell squatted over the sergeant's body and made a crucifix with his hands. He pillaged the mush and recovered the dog tags of the late Corporal Barnes. Lindell said a somber prayer. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, but he die. Yet shall he live. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson broke his silence by firing a single round of his revolver into Maddox's left foot. The unexpected shot echoed through the hallway with a ferocious crack. DeStefano instinctively grabbed Johnson's gun with his right hand and slammed his fist into his jaw with his left hand. Johnson fell to the ground like a sack of potatoes being tossed off the back of a truck. DeStefano stood over the retired lieutenant colonel and said, We don't shoot unarmed hostages, especially American hostages. Are you out of your fucking mind? Little did DeStefano realize it, but he knocked the colonel out cold. Lindell pulled out a bag of Quick Clot from his pouch and held it with his teeth as he examined Maddox's foot. Hold still, he said to the moaning mercenary. She writhed in pain and attempted to hold back the tears. Lindell noticed and remarked at the absurdity of the mercenary's feeble effort to resist showing the pain. She took a deep breath and did her best to swallow the pain. The mercenary fought her instincts to lash out in pain. She was intent to just bury it deep down inside, like an old scarf being shoved into the back of a dresser. Don't be so damn macho. You got shot. Cry if you have to, Lindell said in a reassuring voice to the mercenary. Maddox refused to let her guard down and let out so much as a whimper escape her. Her stubbornness was a trademark. She considered it a badge of honor. For a mercenary in her profession, reputation often never met reality. Lindell gestured over to Hernandez. See that guy over there? The mercenary was unfazed by his question and started taking deep, lumbering breaths like a woman about to give birth to a 10-pound baby. Even big, tough guys like Hernandez cry once in a while. Hey, Hernandez, you have a good cry lately? Only after sex, Hernandez responded. The mood noticeably lightened in the room. Everyone was dancing on the razor's edge and needed some kind of respite. Turns out, a little self-deprecating humor was just what the doctor ordered. Maddox smiled and started to let her guard down. Sergeant Allen, on the other hand, wasn't quite sure what to do. Being indecisive was not in his nature. This situation wasn't in the handbook. This situation wasn't in the training manual. This situation wasn't what anyone had expected. DeStefano, relieve the retired colonel of his weaponry, Allen ordered his teammate. My pleasure, he said. DeStefano grabbed the colonel by chest plate and forcibly cut off his tactical gear. Mike Allen squatted down next to the mercenary and continued the interrogation. Who hired you? She remained steadfast in her loyalty to the client. Lindell took the gauze out from his pack and held it over her foot. Allen waved him off in an attempt to get her to disclose more information. Who hired you? Allen asked in a more irreverent tone. His patience was wearing thin with the mercenary's lack of cooperation. She cleared her throat and responded. I told you. His name was Billy. He owned the security contract for the island. DeStefano looked back at the mercenary with a look of confusion on his brow. The security contractor for the island wanted you to snatch a 70-year-old super soldier serum. That's your story. That's what you're going with? Maddox looked back at the Sergeant Allen with a look of disgust and confusion. I guess the real question is why in the world would Lieutenant Colonel Johnson want to shoot you? How the hell should I know? You'll have to ask him. Allen swung his rifle in the direction of the retired colonel, shining his rail-mounted LED flashlight on the colonel's slumbering body. He was sleeping like a baby after a good feed. DeStefano, do me a favor. Wake the colonel up for me, the sergeant said with a slight chuckle. Tony snapped his fingers twice in the direction of Lindell. Lindell pulled out some smelling salts out of his back pocket and tossed them over to the gunnery sergeant. DeStefano snagged the salt bags out of the air and started shaking them in his hand. He grabbed the back of the colonel's neck and ripped the bag open in his mouth. He raised the colonel's head up slightly and muzzled his mouth. The colonel jolted back to life in an instant. He looked around the room carefully, trying to regain his composure. The gunnery sergeant had his knee firmly implanted into the chest of the colonel. The squad guarded the corridor with an unparalleled zeal that only to be matched by their own paranoia. There was a heightened sense of awareness after finding the remains of once beloved medical sergeant. You good? DeStefano looked at Lieutenant Colonel with skepticism. He could care less about the real answer. Tony was merely attempting to gauge the threat level. I'm good, the lieutenant colonel said, trying to get up from the ground. Good. No more hooting and hollering from you, and we should all be copacetic, DeStefano said while politely restraining the lieutenant colonel. To his surprise, the retired colonel was not putting up any resistance. Get him on his feet, the sergeant ordered. Whitaker and DeStefano grabbed the lieutenant colonel and lifted him up by his ears like an old cartoon. Okay, we're going to start over. Fresh start, the sergeant announced and clapped his hands together. The intelligence officer cleared his throat with an audible gulping sound. It was understood that the time for fucking around was over. It was understood that the time for withholding information was long over. It was understood that the time for friendly interrogations was long over. I want you to listen, and listen carefully. That way you know how serious I am about this question. I want you to truly comprehend me. The sergeant put his hands on the shoulders of the retired colonel and then gently patted his face with both palms. The sergeant turned around to DeStefano and snagged the knife from his boot. He walked over to Barnes' helmet and grabbed it as well. He kicked the helmet over to the lieutenant colonel. It swashed back and forth with blood as it slid over to the colonel. I'm going to ask you one time, and one time only, he said while twirling the knife in the spherical looping motion. The sergeant walked back over to the colonel and cut the respirator from his face. Tensions were running high, and the sergeant was trying to prevent this mission from becoming a complete boondoggle. If you give me some chicken shit answer, hell, if you look at me wrong, I'm going to make you drink this shit, he said while pointing over the corporal's blood-laden helmet. The helmet swashed with an amalgamation of brain matter and chunks of skull. The lieutenant colonel let out an uncomfortable gulp. This time it was a little less audible than before. Large sweat droplets began to run down his forehead and cover the brow above his eyes. The droplets swelled up, creating these comically large reservoirs of sweat. It was becoming rather obvious to the men that Lieutenant Colonel had no actual combat experience. How that could happen is anyone's guess. The luxury of time is one we no longer possess. The luxury of having the elements of surprise is one we no longer possess. The luxury of keeping mission-critical intel to ourselves is one we no longer possess. That being said, what the fuck are we dealing with down here? The color fell from his face, and he almost went limp. DeStefano and Whitaker noticeably had to hold up the retired colonel. To the untrained eye, it looked like the colonel was attempting to struggle, but in reality, he was close to passing out. You know, Fort Terry was founded in 1897. My grandfather was stationed on the island around 1900. His son was stationed in 1950, and I was stationed here in 1990. The island has served one purpose all of those many years, and the fort has served one purpose all those years. Mike Allen was not amused with the story time bullshit, so he held up the helmet and tipped it towards the colonel. But the colonel took a deep breath and said, "Experimental bioweapons, the last resort kind of bioweapons, world enders. The first WMDs were developed on Plum Island." Preach pulled out his Bible to calm his nerves and read a passage aloud. "When the Lamb broke the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, 'Come.' I looked, and behold an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth, to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by the wild beasts of the earth." When my father took over as head of the chemical weapons specialist for Fort Terry, he had what? He had to deal with some unique challenges, such as the fort experimented on run-of-the-mill type stuff in the beginning. Lyme disease, Spanish flu, things like that. That all changed around 1950. What happened in 1950? Operation Paperclip. That's what happened, the colonel said in a self-assured tone. The men all stared back at the colonel with blank expressions. The men were understandably confused by the history lesson. "Don't any of you kids read?" "Operation Paperclip." "No, nothing." The colonel looked at the squadron with a superficial smile garnished with a splash of amusement. "Berlin was split down the middle in 47. The Russians took the east and we took the west. We took over 1,600 Nazi scientists, engineers, and various technicians out of Germany. We took them, gave them nice fake American names, and boom, we made them American citizens. All courtesy of the soon-to-be renamed Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner for the CIA. "Get the fuck out of here," Hernandez said. "What do you think founded this very building, gentlemen? We're standing in this epicenter of the bioweapon development for the better half of the last century. The deadliest diseases known to man right here in this building. All thanks for Nazi scientists and gain-of-function research." At this point, Stefano and Whitaker had retracted their grip from the colonel. He wasn't a threat, at least not compared to what the men might face in the inner workings of Building 257. The mission took a bizarre turn for the worse, like the moment when the crew on the Titanic realized they were about to hit an iceberg. The German scientists were instrumental in the development of all sorts of viruses in this lab. They were ruthlessly efficient and exacting in their genetic sequencing. Overnight, we went from playing checkers to 4D chess. It was a game changer in biowarfare. Taking non-human viruses and manipulating the genetic sequencing to make them compatible with human hosts. "The super soldier serum is real?" Maddox proclaimed. The squad looked back to Maddox as she stood up and dusted off her uniform. Plumes of dust exploded off the uniform she stole from the security guard. As she patted down the uniform, she noticed the name badge stitched into the breast pocket. This sobered up the mercenary to the reality of her situation. People are dead, and mostly that was a direct result of her actions. Believe it or not, it is as real as you and I. SS1 was the kind of virus you tucked away and never spoke about. The initial testing wasn't what we expected. So the brass scrapped the project and moved on to other research. Before I left, they were more interested in some kind of batch research of some nonsense. "What does it do?" Janowski asked. "The real question isn't, what does it do? No. The real question is, how do you survive an outbreak?" "So what are you saying? Barnes was attacked by some kind of super soldier?" "Could be. Or it could be a bunch of mercenaries running around tearing up the place. What I'm saying is that I don't know," the colonel said indignantly. He attempted to get into a more comfortable position, but was only met with Whitaker shaking his head. The colonel realized he was out of friends. The colonel realized he had made this bed. The colonel realized he needed to spill the beans. God help us. If it's SSS-1. How about we keep God out of this one? Lindell added to the conversation. The retired colonel let out a large sigh of relief and continued his remarks. The SSS-1 had a 99% kill ratio in the clinical trial of infected patients. Initial testing of the virus mutated patients in a way. The virus enhanced the patient's speed, increased awareness to threats, made the soldiers into damn near unstoppable killing machines. Okay, well that's just lovely, Hernandez responded while flickering its light on and off in the face of the retired colonel. How does this shit spread? Is it airborne? Sergeant Allen asked. If we were dealing with SSS-1, which is still yet to be confirmed, the good news is that it can only spread from direct injection into the bloodstream. It's not airborne. At least that's the intel I have on SSS-1. The colonel slowly trailed off into a silent stupor. Hey, so it's not all bad news, right? Hernandez squawked and went back to scanning the room with his flashlight. Hernandez wasn't frightened easily, but this mission had clearly struck a nerve. Whitaker pulled the sergeant aside for an off-the-books conversation. The kind of conversation that wouldn't make after-action report. The kind of conversation that no operator ever wanted to have. The kind of conversation that created vendettas. Sarge, I've got a bad feeling about this guy. What do you suggest I do about it, exactly? Whitaker looked back at the lieutenant colonel for a moment. The colonel stared at the ground with a lifeless, bland expression. Whitaker pulled the sergeant in close with his hand over his shoulder. He was doing his best to keep the topic of this conversation between the two men. He's going to get us all killed, sir. Look at him. He's a company man. He's been withholding mission-critical information from us this whole time. What more does he have to do? The sergeant attempted to sneak a look back at Lieutenant Colonel, like a guy sneakily checking out an attractive girl at a bar without making it too obvious. The sergeant covered his mouth and said, I can't. The men trust your judgment. The men will follow you to hell and back. This piece of shit will be our undoing. He'll stab us in the back the first chance he gets. Ordinarily, Whitaker was the most cocksure of the bunch, but for some reason was reticent with his sidebar conversation. Mike wooed Whitaker into a more candid conversation. What are you saying? Be concise about what you say next. Don't sugarcoat it. I'm saying I care about you. I'm saying I care about this squad. I'm saying I could care less about this motherfucker. I'm saying maybe he was hit by a stray bullet. Or maybe we lock him in a broom closet. The longer he tags along with us, the more time for him to scheme our demise. The sergeant stared at Whitaker with an unpleased expression stamped across his face. Whitaker was laying in an impassable conundrum at his feet. The sergeant relied on Whitaker's unshakable judgment in the past, and it ended up saving his life more than once. He took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. It was a lame attempt to stall for time as he mulled over Whitaker's proposition. He's not one of us, Whitaker pleaded. You're right, but he's our responsibility, the sergeant replied dismissively. Sir. Those are your orders, Todd. The sergeant placed his hand on Whitaker's left shoulder and said loud enough for the entire squad to take notice. The sergeant tolerated some healthy back and forth. The sergeant tolerated some healthy discussion. The sergeant tolerated hearing each man's point of view. What the sergeant didn't tolerate was insubordination. Sir. Yes, sir, Whitaker said and immediately halted his protest. Janikowski, please detain the retired lieutenant colonel. Kyle didn't pack any restraints for this mission. Taking prisoners wasn't very customary for this squad. He rummaged through his backpack looking to rig some kind of solution. That'll do the trick, he said aloud while pulling out some repelling cord from his bag. You know what you're doing, son. I'm your superior officer. The colonel said as Janikowski began to bind his hands behind his back. Sure do, the corporal said while tightening the colonel's restraints. Anything else we could do for you, Colonel? Maybe a Mai Tai, a blowy? Hernandez asked while shaking his head in disbelief. Hernandez was unpleased by the lack of intelligence coming from the intelligence officer. On me, Allen ordered the squad. The squad had hastily diverged to the sergeant's position. They formed a small cluster around the sergeant's position. The sergeant took a knee and started mapping out a plan for the squad. One thing that men knew about Mike Allen, and it was that he always relished the planning process. So, what's the plan, boss? DeStefano asked with genuine curiosity. The men eagerly awaited their marching orders. Each one of them was ready, able and willing to spill blood for their fallen comrade. At the drop of a hat, the men were prepared to vanquish any foe, any threat that lay in wait. It was time for some get back. What do we know? Allen polled his squad for an answer. Back in the real world, Mike Allen was a big-shot business tycoon at some insurance company. He always found it useful to pretend to get people involved in the decision-making process. Well, this building about to collapse on us like a falling house of cards. And? Mike asked. And Bravo team is MIA somewhere in the facility. And what else? Mike asked. Bonds is KIA. And? Mike asked. Whereabouts of Dr. Kerrigan are still unknown. Exactly. We don't know Dick. Right? The sergeant reassured the group of their strategic implied odds. The men clutched onto their M4s like a bunch of old ladies clutching onto their purses in a bad part of town. The men casually shook their heads in agreement as Mike paraded them through a crash course in the Democratic leadership style. But you know who does, the sergeant said as he put a spotlight on Maddox and Colonel Johnson. These two vagabonds, the sergeant said while pointing at the mercenary and the colonel. Instantaneous sign of solidarity that the squad started nodding in agreement. These two dumb bastards are how we make it out here alive. These two are the proverbial keys to the kingdom. These two are how we salvage the sop, the sergeant repeated. Maddox stood up from her prone position and outstretched her hands. She clasped them together and cracked all of her knuckles at once. She finally found enough freedom to engage with the squad. Well, boys, I'm game. One thing, though, if I'm going down this rabbit hole with you, I'll need some firepower, the mercenary explained to her new squad mates. DeStefano grinned and detached one of his sidearms from his holster. He wasn't very fond of his .45 caliber nickel-plated hand cannon, but it would be in fine hands with the mercenary. He wiped some blood off the gun and handed it over to the mercenary. That settles that. DeStefano takes point and let's GTFO. Mike ordered the squad. Sir, yes, sir, DeStefano said and turned down the corridor with his barrel drawn, followed by Janikowski on his hip. He further ordered his team. Janikowski shot thumbs up, moved into position behind DeStefano. Lindell, please do us all the favor of escorting the colonel. With pleasure, he said while grabbing the colonel's arm. Lindell's grip clamped on the colonel like a piece of wood between a vice grip. Maddox, you're by my side at all times. If Maddox dies, we all can kiss our asses goodbye. Yeah, I like the sound of that. Keep me alive at all costs, boys, she said with a smile and a nod. She slightly raised the .45 caliber revolver and positioned herself to movement with the squad. Any questions? Mike asked the room. Sir, no, sir, the group shouted in unison. The squad was subtly swaying forward and backwards. Lindell started a faint humming. It reverberated throughout the silent hallways. What's the good word, Preach? Hernandez asked. Preach smiled and said, You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you and my loving eye on you. Hoorah! Let's move out, Mike shouted over the comm line. DeStefano started walking down the hallway with his gun drawn. He swiveled his barrel from the left to the right of the hallway. He was making sure that no crevice was unchecked. He was ready for some real carnage. He was ready for some get back. He was ready to get revenge for his fallen comrade in arms. Each footstep that the squad took echoed on the tile floor. The pitter-patter of the rain was still lingering in the background. The floor tiles were clearly neglected and poorly maintained over the years. The squad followed DeStefano's lead down a long corridor. The corridor was long, narrow, and tall. At the end of the hallway, there was an emergency exit sign, flickering on and off. Stefano noticeably slowed his pace to a crawl, like a car puttering along on its last ounce of gasoline. He stopped at the end of the hallway and started to examine the door with a pocket LED flashlight. "Sir, seems we've located the main stairwell." "No shit, Sherlock." "Keep digging, Watson." "Zip it," the sergeant whimpered as he stepped up to the door. He began to evaluate the integrity of the door. He pressed up on the door with his forearm. Unfortunately, life wasn't going to be that easy for the sergeant, because it didn't budge an inch. He turned to Whitaker and pointed his finger at him. Whitaker pulled out a wrecking bar from his backpack and stepped up to the door. He stood at the door and looked for a prime spot to pry from the door. He slammed the wrecking bar into the door. The clashing of metal on metal made a loud screeching sound. Whitaker looked back at the squad with a curious grin, like Babe Ruth stepping up to the plate at Yankee Stadium. "Grip it and rip it," Janikowski shouted. Whitaker pulled back on the bar with all his force. He groaned and moaned as he pulled back on the wrecking bar. The door snapped open and swung off its hinges. The metal slamming against the ground echoed throughout the hallway. The men stood at ready and encircled the entrance of the stairwell. "Janikowski, flare." Janikowski grabbed a flare from Whitaker's outstretched hand. He ripped the cap off and popped the flare over his knee. He crept towards the entrance of the stairwell and with the flick of a wrist, gingerly tossed the flare down. The flare tumbled and twirled down the empty stairwell, bouncing off rails and steps. As the corporal was about to peer his head into the stairwell, the gunnery sergeant grabbed his right shoulder. The corporal's progress was instantly halted, leaving him standing in the middle of the doorway. "Move aside, Junior. I got this." The corporal looked back and answered the gunnery sergeant with a simple response. He nodded his head once and fell back. Stefano tilted his M4 into the upper corner of the door, and then swept the upper stairwell. He pivoted to his left and looked down the stairwell. The gunnery sergeant looked straight forward and held up his fist. "Coast is clear," he said as he stepped through the doorway. He took a long step into the stairwell and began to scan the environment, every direction. Sergeant Allen patted Janikowski on the shoulder and pointed forward. Janikowski plunged into the stairwell behind Stefano. Lindell grabbed his dog tags and nervously rubbed them together. There was a faint click each time the aluminum dog tags rubbed together. Sergeant Allen motioned over to Lindell. Lindell dropped his dog tags and moved forward into the breach. Maddox stepped up to the first sergeant's position. She swayed herself back and forth, leaning in and leaning out. She held the muzzle of her gun at the floor with her gaze attuned at the breach. The sergeant smiled with an eager anticipation. He was chomping at the bit to see the mad dog in action. He patted her on the shoulder and she breached the doorway. The rest of the squad followed Stefano down the stairwell. Lindell held up the rear and escorted Colonel down the stairwell. Lindell unconsciously found himself periodically nudging the colonel with the barrel of his gun. The squad followed the bright glare of the glow stick down the stairwell. As they proceeded down the stairwell, Hernandez slipped and his knee buckled, slamming against the wall of the stairwell. "Fuck! Give me some light over here!" Hernandez shouted while trying to recover his footing and regain his composure. Janikowski shined his light towards Hernandez. Hernandez looked down at the ground and grabbed onto the rail to pull himself up. The handrail was ice cold like a flagpole in a snowstorm. "What the fuck?" Hernandez held up his hand into the air and began to inspect it. His hand was crimson red, like a child who just discovered the joy of finger painting. Lindell immediately ran over to Hernandez and started assessing the scene. He grabbed his hand and started checking it. "Where did you hurt?" To Lindell's surprise, Hernandez ripped his hand from the grip of the medic. "It's not mine!" he shouted back at Lindell as he regained his footing. The men started examining the stairwell in greater detail. Blood had soaked every inch of the stairwell. The question was, whose blood was it? Mike Allen squatted at the bottom of the stairwell and grabbed the flare from the floor. He waved it in the air in an attempt to brighten the room. The blood had a darker hue than the blood found upstairs. There were large black chunks of congealed blood and guts sprinkled across the floor. The mood in the room shifted to a more morose and somber feeling. The pool of blood had footprints leading to the entrance of the main biolab. The men were in hot pursuit of something. Spent shell casings littered the ground from the stairwell. Whitaker knelt down like a catcher behind the home plate. Looks like we have some 5.56 millimeters, 223s, 45s, and even some 9 millimeters scattered all around here, sir, he said while examining the scene. Looks like there was gunfire in damn near every direction, he explained. Whitaker pointed his flashlight upward to find the bullet holes everywhere, even the ceiling. In every direction, he repeated while shining the light on the ceiling. DeStefano scrutinized the handle of the door like a scientist looking through a microscope. He stared at the handle of the door with an intense frustration. At first glance, it seemed completely normal. For some reason, that perturbed the gunnery sergeant. Sir. Allen slung his rifle over his shoulder and proceeded to the gunnery sergeant's position. How are we looking, Gunny? It looks clear. The sergeant walked back to the former intelligence sergeant. His boots made squishy thuds stomping around in the blood. He walked up to the retired colonel and politely pleaded. So, anything you want to add before we breach that door?